Hello, everyone. Welcome to Data Discourse Podcast Season 2, Episode 2. In this episode, we're bridging the gap between IT and eDiscovery providers, how they can work smarter together. I'm host Pete Mansmann of Precise. Today, our guests are Matt Campbell, who's CTO in the behavioral health and human services sector, President and CEO of Steel River Techs. And Matt, welcome. I'm going to let you give your background here a little bit deeper in just a second. And we have Bill Saccani, Esquire, who's president of Precise Discovery LLC. And we welcome you both. And before we jump into this any further, Matt, you want to give us a little more about your background here and how you've come to know Bill and Precise?
So I've been in the IT industry for over 30 years now at this point. My degrees are actually in business, and then the IT stuff I kind of learned on the job and got technical certifications throughout the years, and held mostly technical positions and then technical management positions, kind of moved up through the ranks. Worked for consulting firms, for health organizations, for private equity firms, and really kind of ran the gambit of everything that IT needs. So, anything a small business or a healthcare organization would need, I've been involved with it in some way, shape, or form over the years. I've known Bill since high school, been friends for quite a long time. And then, as we grew up through the industry and our professional paths crossed again a couple different times where I've had clients that needed some assistance, or I was, subpoenaed myself in order to provide information and needed to work with a firm such as yours in order to get that eDiscovery.
Well, that's great, and we all go back from the same haunting grounds from back in the day. So we're three boys who made it out of Ringgold, so we can be proud of that.
Yeah, yes. Steps to success. Number one, get out of the valley.
That's right. Well, we appreciate you joining us here today, and season 2 of this podcast, Matt, we talked about this a little bit over lunch, but this is conversational. We really wanted to bring guests in as to sort of fill out our season 2. And one of the things that we've come across regularly in the eDiscovery world, and this is really going to be a conversation largely between you and Bill, is that in us doing eDiscovery and computer forensics work, we are crossing paths with IT departments, internal and external, all the time. And there are some things that we think easily flow between the two, and sometimes where it gets a little more difficult. We wanted to explain in more detail what our role typically is and get your perspective on how can we better do a job of explaining that and not, get in each other's way in some areas where sometimes it might seem that we're doing things sort of overdone, but there's a purpose behind that. So that'll be the general conversation of our discussion here today, and I'll do my best to not talk too much here and let you two take it. So I want to start off today just to basically say that, again, today's focus is on improving collaboration between internal and external or outsourced IT departments and eDiscovery service providers to boost efficiency and cut costs. I think generally speaking, and Bill, I would be curious to see if you agree with this or not, but it seems that there's been a trend in the last 10 years for sure, where we're dealing with a lot more outsourced IT support providers as related to the clients that we get engaged with. Would you generally agree with that?
Yes. I mean, there's definitely that outsource now that companies are becoming leaner and running, a little bit leaner. They outsource their IT. And, a lot of times, with that being said, there may be internal IT, but it's usually one person that can't really fulfill a large request in a very quick manner.
And Matt, are you seeing the same thing? I'm guessing you are, because that's kind of the space you live in.
Yeah, that is my bread and butter. Yeah, we are seeing that as well too. The reality is that when you outsource the IT, you can actually bring in better expertise. Two, you remove a lot of the HR headaches that you have when you have that internally. And three, if you need support for longer than an 8-hour window, especially if you need 24/7 support, it's very difficult to build that up and build that expertise internally unless you're really large. So, every company, small business will hit that breaking point where, the person who's pretty good at computers can no longer do that. They're focusing on fixing people's computers, setting computers up, doing, the general day-to-day tasks. And they're probably not even covering everything they should be covering. They're just kind of doing the things that they know to do. So they're, setting up the computers, maybe making sure antivirus is on there, maybe not, doing the backup that they got an ad for when they were on YouTube, whatever the case is, but it's not always the best of breed solution. So working with a managed service provider, MSP, working with someone like us, we bring that expertise to the table. We're always looking for what the industry's doing, things that are changing, new threats in cybersecurity, and kind of everything that really takes a full focus in order to actually protect a company the way you really need to.
And it makes a lot of sense, especially mid and small size companies, which we were one, to have a full-time IT staff or people probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that, where we may have some internal expertise on certain things, certainly it makes sense. We would reach out to a company like yours and say, hey, can you support us in these things? And I think that's the trend, that unless you're a large organization, that's probably how you're doing most of your IT services.
Right, exactly. And there's, a lot of areas of expertise too, being a network engineer, even if you have a company that you might think is relatively small, 50 people, 25 people, even 10, you still need to have the right cybersecurity set up. You need to have the right network set up. As more and more stuff moves to the clouds, phone systems, more people are using, since COVID, just about everybody uses some sort of streaming video to communicate daily. Right. So if your network isn't configured correctly, if your network's not set up right, you're going to end up having different issues. But having that knowledge of how you set up a computer, how you do general support, how you manage that computer, and then also how you manage that network, that's a pretty broad array of skill set that you need in order to manage that. So working with a company like ours, you get my expertise, but you also get my staff expertise. I tell our customers all the time, you don't want to call me for general support, because I don't do it that often anymore. You want to call the expert in when you want something done for your network, or you have something that's more of the business focus, how you can improve efficiencies using technology within your business. You want to be able to bring in the expert like myself to help you with those tasks and to help you figure out how to navigate cybersecurity and changes that are coming down the road, how you navigate different compliance issues. But you don't want me fixing your computer. It'll probably take me twice as long as it will take any of my guys, just because I don't do it every day.
Right. Well, and then sort of the intersection between what Bill does and what you do is that, so in our eDiscovery and computer forensics services and companies, we're typically engaged by law firms. That most of the time, that's how we get involved. And either litigations happened, they anticipate it's going to happen, an investigation's happening, something along those lines, where again, lawyers typically are getting involved. And they bring us in because they say, listen, we know there's a different set of standards about how data needs to be handled in order for it to be admissible at court, usable, reliable, all those types of things that sort of live in a different world in a court setting. And we need you to go do that and go get the data that we need. And here they'll give us the generalities of what they're looking for. But then they say, all right, most cases, you're going to interface with our client's IT support provider, whether internal or external. And for our purposes today, I think let's talk about, using an external provider like yourself. And they say, go get it. And then that's where the intersection of our paths would typically cross. So I guess, Bill, a question to you more. I mean, is that how you typically see it, or do you see other scenarios where you're getting engaged with IT companies, or is that the most typical?
For us at Precise, that is the most typical. We have an attorney who's dealing with the client's matter and says, this is what I need. I need email. I need data from servers. I need you to go out to the company or their IT people and figure out and get us this data. Usually start with dealing with the company and have them either provide us with the IT contact, just because we don't want to end up calling an IT company and saying, hey, give us this data. So we need the client to actually interface and make sure that all of that is taken care of, and they know that we're have the permission to gather the data. And then that's when we rely on the IT company to tell us the basic configurations of how the company's set up, how email is set up, and what we're looking at as far as going to collect this data.
Yeah, and I'll say, just to add to this, that what's the first thing everybody wants to know anytime they engage professional services? How much is this going to cost me? And that the way we find that out is, all right, well, how much data are we dealing with? How many people? What's our time frames? So we're gathering up general configurations from the attorneys and saying what's relevant to what we have to deal with. But step number one typically is, at least in most engagements, I think, hey, we need to talk to the IT people about giving us some first general reporting so we know for real what we're dealing with. Because I can't tell you how many times that attorneys have come to us and said, hey, I got 5 people. It might be 6 years, it might be 7 years. We might need email. They might have some computers, or could be some phones. What's this going to cost me? It's like, could be $1 million. It could be $1. We don't know. We have no idea until we get into some really specifics of what. And that oftentimes, I think, is the first conversation we have with IT people. And maybe you can talk about how you do that kind of reporting when you get those kind of requests.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Some of our largest data usage customers are smallest when it comes to the number of people. A lot of it depends on what it is that they're actually doing. And, a lot of times just the quantity of documents doesn't necessarily mean, the size. Like, if you're an architecture firm or you're doing something with a lot of media, CAD files are a lot larger than Word documents, for example. So, someone coming to you and saying, hey, we have this, or company that has 4 or 5 people, or 75 people, and maybe 8 devices across there, 140 devices, that really doesn't mean much until you actually look at what it is they're actually doing and what you're actually going to have to work with. And everything can be a little bit different too if it's on premise, or if it's stored in the cloud, or if they don't have a server at all. Even just the access, if they're using Azure for all of their Active Directory stuff, or if they're still have their on-prem, or small companies sometimes, and there's a lot of financial companies out there too that actually have a policy set up that they don't have a domain controller, so everybody has local access accounts. So then it makes things even more difficult. So just number of devices isn't really a good starting point. So you have to know how those devices are used, how they're distributed across that company, what type of information a company is typically storing, and how they're storing it. So whenever we get a request, first thing we do is, we take a look at them with our, remote management and monitoring tools, take a look at, how many email boxes they have, different things like that, and just their overall size. So, by the backups we run and a lot of the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis, we can get you a better picture pretty quickly. That usually doesn't take too long. Some of our clients that are on our Premier package that includes, compliance levels, we have a compliance tool that actually is going to provide a lot of that information over to you very quickly. So, it really depends on the client and how they're set up, but everybody's kind of, a little unique in their own way, and it depends on the information that you're looking for and the situation at hand. A lot of times we'll get requests in and they're like, hey, we need all this, we need it for everybody. And then when we come back and show them how large everybody is, they're like, oh, well, there's actually only 4 people involved with this lawsuit. Maybe we just need the 4 people. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, the reality, or the narrowing in on what's important, comes after people see the price tag tied to overdoing it. But the flip side is, especially, and I'd like to get Bill's perspective on this, like, we have to be broad enough at the front end to eliminate having to come back to the well multiple times if we didn't get it right. And Bill, maybe you can talk about, from your perspective of a eDiscovery provider, what are some of your concerns initially about what our obligations are, what we may be held to in terms of later on down the line about what happened when, and the broadness that we want to collect with at the beginning, so that we have what we need to answer all sort of variations that are inevitably going to come with discovery requests.
Sure. So from our perspective, we're going to be held to task by the court system, by our clients, that everything was done in a forensically sound manner. So basically, we have to know how we pulled this data off of the servers. We have to know how we pulled this data out of the email servers. We have to know, what steps were taken and how they were done correctly to be able to answer those questions for our client, for the court, if we're asked that. So that's the first thing. So we like to work with the IT people to make sure that, we have a full understanding of how the system's set up and all the information out there. But we want to make sure that we are really intimately involved in collecting the data. And that could come in a variety of different ways. One, we can work with the IT people directly. If for some reason it's a very sensitive matter, we could work with them and have our IT professionals oversee what they're doing so that we can answer those questions and be able to be the ones to talk to the clients, to the attorneys, to the court as to, what was done and wasn't done appropriately. As far as collection, we like to do it with probably a broader stroke than actually necessary, not by much, but this is all a burden on the IT resources, and the company may not, there may be, some inconvenience for the company as waiting for email boxes to download and things like that. So we like to kind of grab a wider breadth as necessary so that this only has to be done at one time. So, for example, if somebody says, okay, we believe that we're going to collect data from 2005 to 2010, and we have these custodians, and we want these 10 search terms. That's all good, and it all filters things down and gets you a narrower scope. But if we go ahead and run those search terms, inevitably later on in the case, somebody's going to say, well, we want these 5 additional search terms, and we need every data on, or every document that contains these. So now we have to go back to the well again and rerun searches and pull data again. So it's basically just never ending. Just keep going back and having to inconvenience the company to do an additional search. If we go broad enough that we collect everything from the targeted custodians and the time frame and leave it at that at the high level, when we bring it into our systems internally, now we can run additional search terms without ever affecting the company itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think, a lot of IT people, because, we're not involved with court cases every day, right? So a lot of times we don't understand the reason why you want to grab everything at once and make one trip. And, one, it's more efficient. It's going to be more cost effective for the client, but also two, you don't want that inconvenience factor. But a lot of times we don't understand that. We think, well, why do you need that? It doesn't affect this. But, we're not lawyers, so we don't really know exactly what it is that you're going to need. When you're called to do these types of searches and you need to look for things, end users don't always know exactly where every single file is located. Just by the nature of your work, as you're doing things throughout the day, you might accidentally save something into a different file, or you might have, been working on one document and not realize that you accidentally saved the other document into the same folder that doesn't really have to do anything with it. We get calls all the time. Hey, I need help finding this file. I was working on this really important document. I was working on this, working on that. I can't find this. I can't find the earlier version of the Excel file I was working on. I saved the revision. I can't find it. So when you take that broader approach to it, you can capture everything, because you might not know exactly what you're looking for until after you get back into your system, you actually do your searches. So I think that's pretty important.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that both your points, what you guys just talked about, which is important, is that we all are kind of saying the same thing, which is like at this stage, we may not really know what it is we need or where something existed or not. And this goes back to why it has to be broad to begin with, because it's like the lawyer might come back to us in 6 months and say, you know what, I've just discussed this with the other side and they want to run X, Y, and Z search terms and they want to include these people and everything like that. And it's like, if you haven't collected it at that point, you're either going to have to go back and recollect, or you're going to have to broaden it. And this is, again, going back and dipping in the well over and over again. And beyond an inconvenience factor, we also run into the issues that, any time frame that happens between an initial collection and a subsequent, something can be deleted, something can be moved, a system can go down, things are migrated, and so now you've created more complexity and making sure your collection is broad as possible. And I think that the tools that we ultimately have to use in the eDiscovery world or in the forensics world, searching for things, is very different in a lot of ways than the IT tools that you might be utilizing on a day-to-day basis to find things that are important for somebody to look at for a specific task. We are using a very different broad set of sort of search criteria and tools that are meeting legal obligations that, you know, even though they have this crossover and maybe some of the same functionalities are you know, have two very distinct different purposes. So, you know, we're always the challenge, I believe, in saying we want to get in there and get out, have what we need to be able to do our job and not keep coming back and bothering you. But we're also very cognizant of the fact that IT resources are a very important part of this step. We want to utilize them where we can to be able to make sure that we're not over collecting where we can avoid it, and utilize your knowledge and resource. We talked about lunch a little bit. You guys know what happened over the history of a client way better than anybody else. So if I say I need, you know, John Smith's emails and data sources for the last 10 years, you're the person who's in a position to tell me, oh yeah, you know what? He switched computers 3 times. He had 2 cell phones. He changed email boxes or whatever it is that we would never know to even ask in some instances without a full picture from IT resources. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's a good point, because, you know, when I first got into this business, everybody that we were supporting were using Microsoft Small Business Server, product that doesn't even exist anymore, right? But all of their email, all of their documents, everything was stored on site there. But as time goes on, technology changes. Well, then it moved from the on-premise small business server that you're always dependent on making sure the office is up and running, to now we're going to run the email in the cloud. So it's a hosted Exchange server, and there were multiple companies that did that. And then it moved from that over to the Microsoft 365 platform. There's also, you know, G Suite is out there as well too. Those are really probably about the main 2 platforms that everybody uses. But, you know, we've taken over small businesses that use the free internet email, the POP email, the IMAP email that came standard with their website. They're using that, and they don't understand that, you know, a lot of that information is only stored on that PC that they're using. So when we start working with them, we're telling them, hey, you know, you should really migrate to Microsoft 365. The reason is, you know, everything's stored in the cloud. It's not dependent on your local devices. But the number of times where we've had to, you know, pull out an old laptop because, you know, they used this laptop when they first started, we didn't support them, and now there's email on that laptop that they need access to for whatever reason. You know, we've gotten calls with some of the smaller clients when we first took them over. That is one of the conversations we have of, why do you want to use certain tools? Well, this is the reason why. You know, there's always that bigger picture of, you might have to do these certain things. Maybe it's a legal standpoint. Maybe it's just usually it's more of a standpoint of just, I want to be able to support my customers better. You know, so if I, you know, I have all my emails stored locally on device versus stored up in the cloud, it's going to be harder for me to support my customers.
Okay, Bill. So let's follow this up with a question to you. So we just talked about how, you know, casting a wide enough net, if you will, is important to make sure we're not coming back and having to do this over and over and over again. But I also think it's important to make sure that there's conversations around how data is collected, where limitations are that an IT professional should consider, and how far they can take it before they hand it off to us. What's your perspective on some basic areas where you get engaged with somebody like Matt, who's very helpful, willing to help, and say, tell me what you need me to do. I'm here to assist you. You know, what are the parameters you put around that so that you're properly using someone like his skill set, but making sure that we're not going overboard where it's going to cause us problems down the line?
Well, that goes to, I think, the forensic side of things, where we want to make sure that all the metadata is captured correctly, all the metadata is staying intact when we do the collections. I think it's a little bit less involved nowadays with email or Microsoft 365 because the PST files that you're collecting from them are a container file and it's keeping all that data intact. It's usually, in the cloud-based storage and servers that we want to make sure that that the IT people understand that all these different data points in the file itself all could be crucial. Doesn't mean in every case that it's necessarily going to be a crucial factor that you absolutely have to have the correct date created. But, from our standpoint, we look at it that every case, that stuff has to stay intact to the best of our ability. So as long as we're working with the IT people, making sure they know the proper tools to use to make sure that it's being copied over in a forensically sound manner so that all that information stays intact, we're more than happy to make sure that we can work with them. And, if it's going to save the client money, we don't have a problem with doing so. But once again, going back to once we get the data in hand, we have to account for that as well. So while we understand the want of the client to use their own IT people, and we understand that many of the IT people like Matt are perfectly capable of doing so, we have to balance that out between what we're going to be called to task with and making sure that all that metadata is captured correctly and is going to be sound throughout the life cycle of the collection, processing, and then finally production to the other side of this data.
That's a good point, because I think your general, especially internal IT, usually don't understand exactly what that metadata is used for and how you have to keep it sound, right? So I think, we certainly know what it means, in being in this field, but we don't necessarily know what those steps are or those collection processes. Also too, that, a lot of times with different dates and how they get stamped and different things like that, especially with syncing tools, that's the reason why, nowadays, most of the time you want to look at what that single actual storage point is. So you want to look at Microsoft 365, or if they're using Dropbox or Box or something of that nature, you want to look at it from that standpoint, not from the end user's computer. So, the IT company is going to know, well, hey, they had a computer that went bad, had a bad hard drive, got lost, stolen, just needed updated, whatever the case is. So, the creation date on their computer is going to be different than what the actual creation date is, because it's what it was when it got synced to the cloud. So that's why you want to look at the cloud source. A lot of times, IT people might think, oh, well, you have their computer, you have, their phone, you can just get it from there. Well, we could, but the most accurate information is actually going to be in that cloud source, not on that computer.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things, and again, this is just the nuance of being in a court setting and having to be able to put reliability on the data that's being exchanged, is that the metadata often becomes important because people are looking at dates and they're looking at versions, histories, and they're looking at when communications happen between people. So something as simple as create a date and can become very important for lawyers looking at cases or documents and saying, look, we got all these documents, they have the same created date. Does this mean that, somebody was trying to hide the ball here or whatever? And we're oftentimes having to tell them this could simply be a copy and paste. It could be in how it was collected when we got it. It could be that somebody moved it from one location to another well before this. There's lots of reasons why these things can change. And we have to sort of temper their expectations about reliability on the different metadata fields that they can put out there. But what we don't want to do is to say, oh, well, we didn't properly instruct somebody, or we didn't give them the heads up that we need to be careful about these things before we get it, because it's just going to cost a lot of lawyer time later on arguing over these things or explaining them. And lawyers are a lot more expensive than any of the three of us on here, and that makes for unhappy people if we have not avoided something we could. So that goes to communication. And I always try, or I think we try to be careful about bridging the gap between educating IT professionals on what we need to do in the legal side of things, but not like trying to tell them, oh, well, let me teach you IT stuff, because that's not what we're trying to do. It's really just trying to be like, this is why these simple IT things are meaningful for us. And ultimately, I always look at it and say, I might be sitting on a stand someday in front of a judge with a jury all looking at me, asking me questions. Well, why did this happen or that happen? If I can't answer it, that's a bad day for me. That's a bad day for our clients. So that's sort of our overreaching observations on all this stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, IT companies generally do not want to be sitting in that stand. That's that's not where we want to be. That's not what our expertise is. Just curious, have you guys ever run into cases where the IT is trying to be helpful and they did a huge copy and paste and said, "Hey, everything you need's in this folder now," instead of just leaving
Yes.
it where it needs to be?
Yes, we have had that situation before, and it's like, oh, okay. I had a client not too long ago that the IT people thought they were being helpful because they took all the stuff that this client said they needed and put it into one big folder for us. But
Right.
it was a copy and paste, put it into the folder. All the data had the same created date, and we were back to having
Square
to
one.
Yeah, and from their perspective, they're like, well, what's the matter? I put all these documents you needed in one place. Isn't that convenient? It's like, yes, but. And again, without knowing that your normal person out there is never going to care about created date, but attorneys and people who are forensically trying to recreate what happened when do. I also think that sometimes the communication lapse that happens with some IT providers, and this is, I think, just the way brains are wired, is I've come across this often that IT people will say, well, you specifically told me this, and that's exactly what I did, where you always have to set it from the beginning to be like, look, I don't know your company's structure. I don't know all your data sources. Let me give you the broad strokes of what we're looking for. I'm looking for input from you, I'm not at the stage where I can say, here's a set of instructions, follow these to the T. I'm trying to figure out what we have to deal with. And sometimes people are comfortable having that conversation. Other times they aren't. A lot of times there's people who are just saying, well, tell me what to do. And it's like, I'm not at that point yet because I don't know. I don't know what you have to tell you what we should be trying to do here at this point. And I know, Bill, you've had some of those conversations before where you really are trying to, at least initially say, hey, I just need communication. Like, you need to tell me the history of this person and what happened versus, I'm just in here after some very specific things.
Right, and we don't have that information a lot of times. And I think we discussed this a little earlier at lunch. It was a good example is somebody, employee that gets married, changes their name. We don't know that they changed their name. We don't know, but if we can have that conversation with IT people and IT resources and say, this is our end goal. This is what we need to come up with is all this responsive documents to this specific set of queries, then they can help us guide us to where those data points exist and how to best collect those.
Right, and especially like with some customers that we take over, it happens more often when you have somebody that's not really IT savvy, that's knows enough to manage like their emails, the email portfolios and setting up new email accounts. So they know enough how to set up new email accounts, but they don't know how to change a person's name. So instead of changing a person's name, changing the login, creating the proper aliases so all of the mail is still contained within that same mailbox, they just create a new mailbox. Sometimes they copy over the other stuff. Sometimes they just give access to that former mailbox, and then the person gets a new computer and they didn't map the old mailbox to the new Outlook profile. So now they just have one profile. That's something that we might know because we took over that client and, we got things kind of fixed and situated and set back up, but you would never know that coming in. Some of our clients have been with us for 15 years. There's been a lot of changes in technology over 15 years. So if they need something that's pretty far back, if you don't have that history, you don't know what happened when, you might be looking for that needle in a haystack forever. And then you ask us the question, we're like, oh yeah, they had a server crash in 2018. So we only copied was new active files onto the new server. Here's the old archive folders. You might not know those things unless you ask us. And we might not even think to tell you unless you ask us. So,
well, and that's it. What from your perspective, Matt, is the best way to sort of have those conversations to sort of set the the concept that, look, we're thinking broader here, and I need your input, to give me history, give me flavor, so we can get to a point where I can say, look, we boiled this down to a set of tasks that need to be executed at this point.
Yeah, I think, just having that open conversation when you first start, asking the open-ended questions. Hey, when did you start working with this client? What was that process like when you took them over? Did they have their own internal IT person before? Was there somebody else doing it? Was there another IT company doing it? What was that transition like? There's depending on like different backup technologies, depending on when they transitioned over, if it was hosted Exchange at the time instead of Microsoft 365, or maybe when they switched over to us, we moved from G Suite over to Microsoft 365. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it, and it's not that one's better than the other. It's just knowing how that happened and what you did. So, a lot of times when you transition, especially smaller companies, when they transition from one technology to another, a lot of times they're going to clean up a lot of the old data that they don't think they need. So it might be relevant, it might not be relevant to, what you guys are doing, but I was telling you that history of, oh yeah, in 2020, they moved from G Suite over to Microsoft 365. At the time, we used BitTitan in order to move everything over. So we migrated all of their data over. Okay, great. Did you migrate every single mailbox over? Initially we're going to be, oh yeah, sure. Yeah, we did. But, then you might say, well, how about John Smith? Did you move over his stuff? Oh no, he wasn't with the company anymore. So we just, left it on G Suite, or we exported it to this, or the client said, oh no, we don't need that anymore. Because that happens too. Especially with companies that have been in business for a long time, they might have mailboxes that exceed the limits of what, Microsoft allows. So right. You might have to, we moved it over, but we moved it over into a separate PST file, or we moved it over and it's just stored in this file share so they can grab it if they do need it, but they don't have it actively mapped to their Outlook. Different, little things like that you might never know. Also sometimes, we've had clients that have had very unexpected deaths happen in their organization. And, sometimes they never thought about what they needed to do for that person's mailbox, or they move somebody into that position and like, they need to have everything that this person had. So we're just going to rename their mailbox to this person, to the new person, right? So now you have, Mary Ann's data now with Roberta's or something crazy, right? So, if you don't know that knowledge, you might be like, well, why was she doing this? And different things like that, where we can provide that information and ask.
Well, I would imagine, I would imagine there's a lot of times that you don't remember what happened 5 years ago, and unless you have a diary system that every single request is mapped every time, you're gonna have to go back and research it a little bit to say, oh yeah, I forgot about that. We did do this, and then it sort of comes back to light.
Yeah, that's why when you have that conversation, even like when we bring somebody over, I try to, whatever that IT company is, if we're taking over from another IT company, and same thing, when we transition somebody out, I try to meet with that company and try to work with them as well too, because you never know at the end of the day what that person might need, or what might end up coming up in the background that's going to prevent them from being able to do their work and to support their clients, right? So, if somebody's transitioning off of us, I want to try and give that new company all the information they have. And if we're bringing somebody on, hopefully it's a good transition. A lot of times it's not. We've gone in where we've had to do kind of our own investigation just to figure out how things were set up. We try to document everything we can. A lot of different tools out there you can use to do that, but that's still only as good as the people that are putting information in. And right. Again, technology changes, and sometimes, if somebody has an issue, our concern is always to get that client up and running as quick as possible. So sometimes in that moment where you're trying to get something up and running, you're trying to fix that server, you're trying to fix that person's computer, you're trying to restore something from somebody that left, or whatever the case is, you might go through, get that back up and running, and then not remember, oh yeah, in order to do this, I changed A, B, and C, or how that computer was, for this person, but since they're no longer with the company, I gave it to this other person just because they needed that. And then, their old computer, well, it's going to go here. A lot of times you might not always recall exactly where they went and what computer they were on. A lot of our tools will give us a lot of that information. And if you have, one of our compliance packages, it gives you even more information. But, a lot of this, all those tools cost money. All those tools, increase the price. Not every small business can afford it, so there is a lot of that stuff that, you just kind of remember, or you have to pull in your techs that support them. I'm not supporting every single client that we have. I rely on my techs to do that. So, there's a lot of times where, if I get a call from the owner and they ask me a question, I'll be like, let me get back to you, because I need to do a little bit of research on mine before I give them a solid answer. I want to make sure that information I provide is correct.
So, Bill, we're often under different timelines or tighter time requests. Maybe you can talk about that a bit, because, it puts a lot of urgency on us. And I can't tell you how many times we've been engaged where it's been like, the court's ordering me to do something like in the next few weeks, or it's gotten to a boiling point where they should have been working on this a long time and they haven't. And now they're calling us and bringing us in because they've got a firestorm to deal with. Bill, can you talk about that a little bit, what some of those pressures are like, and how that translates down to then all of a sudden we come sweeping into some poor IT professional's office, demanding and asking all these questions and answer quickly and getting data, and it's because of just what we've been requested to do.
Sure. Yeah. There's quite often, well, more often than not, that we get the request in the 11th hour, where the court is ordered that this happens, and the attorneys have a deadline, and they have to stick to it, or they're going to probably face sanctions. And I'm not downplaying at all that IT professionals have a lot of the same pressures for different reasons. Like, okay, Matt's client's server goes down, they can't do any work until it's back up and running. Yeah, he's going to take care of that, and he's going to get that done quickly, and he has to. For us, I don't think the IT side of things really understand that this is really a tight deadline for us, and they may have three other, and they are like we have multiple clients that we're doing eDiscovery work for. They have multiple clients that they're supporting IT for, so they may have another firestorm somewhere else, and that's where communication comes into play, where, hey, I can't get to this. Well, okay, you can't get to this, get us access so we can get to this, because
Right.
beyond the IT side of things, once we get all this data, that's just the start of our role in this. Is once we go through this data mapping, figuring out with the IT company where we need to collect data from, how we collect data, who's going to collect the data, and once it comes over to us, now we still have to process, we still have to deduplicate, we still have to OCR everything. And that usually is a lot longer lead time than just the collection. And it takes a lot more effort once we get the data. And as I said, the court is always going to mandate that we meet their deadlines. And it doesn't matter whether we say, hey, the IT people can't get to us for a couple of days because they have a crisis somewhere else. That's just not, that's not really a valid excuse for us. So, I mean, with that being said, that's kind of the quick answer of, we are under usually tight deadlines, and, we have a lot more processing and a lot more work to do after we get the data.
Well, and
that's a good point. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just to add to that, because I think it's important too, is that when we're interfacing with IT companies, a lot of times I think we see this, that we say, all right, we have these 10 custodians, here's our date ranges, here's, what we have to go over, et cetera, that we can be working on things incrementally. So it's like, if you can get us these three, we can start rolling on them. Or if you can get us these 2 data sources, we can start rolling on that, and then just keep feeding us. A lot of times I see that seems to be some hesitation of doing it piecemeal like that. They want to just wait until it's all done and then say, here, it's all available for us. I don't know if that's because it's just easier to do it that way, or it's just there's a reason for that. That's something we seem to struggle with sometimes, to be like, let's do this on a rolling basis so we can get ahead of this.
Yeah, I think from that aspect, a lot of times it's, probably the nature of how they work. And, a lot of IT projects kind of focus on that. I'm not going to give you anything until I have everything type thing. So, that comes into the communications, say, hey, look, we need to have all the data in our hands by this date. We need to have it in our hands by the 5th of the month. But don't wait until the 5th of the month to give it to us. As soon as you have it, send it over to us. And if it's a situation where you guys can just collect the data yourself, honestly, I would prefer you guys just to collect the data yourself. One, it's going to take that workload off of my folks. So if we do have another emergency, we do have other things to get done, you guys have that access. We're not the bottleneck. Like, I don't ever want us to be the bottleneck, especially in something that's a court case. I don't want us to be the bottleneck on the reason why you can't deliver on what you need to. So, typically what we do is, in a case, if you guys need to collect something, we'll go in, we'll meet with the customer as a team. We'll talk to everybody. We'll say, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to divvy up the workload. And, we're going to take care of this because of X, Y, and Z. And Precise is going to take care of this because of ABC. And this is how we're going to do, and this is how we're going to make sure we get everything done. Because at the end of the day, we're all doing this to help our client out. So, we might be sharing the client. You guys might be doing long-term work with them. You might not. But at the end of the day, we just want to make sure that our client gets everything that they need so that they can, continue to do their work on their business so they can continue to support their clients. And, with things being in the cloud, there's a lot of, back in the day, you had to do everything on site. And there's probably still a lot of companies that you have to do a lot of stuff on site. You have to have the phone in order to back it up. You can't, there's no other way to do it right now. There's limitations that Apple puts on you. So you can't grab everything remotely. So there are still things that you need to do, on site. But there's a lot of things that we can start. We can get you access into the Office 365 tenant. We can get you access into any other, cloud storage that they have. If it's a server that's stored in the cloud someplace, whether it's, somebody co-location or just a different data center, if we can get you remote access to that and you can start working on that right away, absolutely. Because the things that are going to be other bottlenecks are if you have to collect 15 different mobile devices from 15 different people, well, now you have to try and gather all those 15 people in the same place to get that all done. Or you're going to have to make multiple trips to different locations in order to get that copy of that phone in order to preserve everything. So there's, my opinion is as soon as you get the information, it's whatever you can get access to you guys as quick as possible, get that done and get that rolling. And then you can focus on the things that are going to take longer to achieve. It never fails, when you're under that deadline, if you try to wait and hold off on everything till you have everything, you're going to miss your deadline. That's just what's going to happen, right? So, nobody takes into account, you have a remote work staff. Well, that remote work staff might be across the entire state. Hey, they're still in Pennsylvania. Yeah, Philadelphia is pretty far from Pittsburgh. You're not getting there in 15 minutes, right? So, if you have to collect a bunch of phones in different locations, or you have to go on site in order to image a laptop or whatever the case is, or there's a different data center that you can't have remote access to and you have to go out on site, there's a lot of different things that could really slow that down. So don't wait until the last minute. Start getting things to you right away and then work on the things that are going to take a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I think getting remote access, to your point, most of our data sources now are either cloud-based or cloud accessible. So, whether it's an IT professional who's logging in and gathering it, or somebody gives us access to go and log in and gather that stuff, Precise has the advantage that our main collection guy, Jeff, is a former IT guy, or he still is in the IT world, but he happens to know forensics as well. So it certainly helps to get him involved in the cases where he can speak IT language, and people, I think, get comfortable with him quicker, understanding, all right, this guy knows what he's talking about. He knows what I'm dealing with, etc. But sometimes there is that hesitation to give remote access or admin access in order to do what we have to do. And I get it, because, especially in heavily regulated industries or sensitive data type businesses, an IT's job is to safeguard that data. They're wired for that. That's their prime directive. So what from your perspective, Matt, do you think are the things that would make an IT professional feel comfortable that, hey, these guys are all right to allow me to give them? I mean, assume obviously you're going to have permission from somebody high enough in the company that they say,
Right.
I'm being told to do this, but are there other things that we can do to show them we're not going to mess up your system? We're not going to just, throw this data out there onto the web for anybody to see. What is it we can do to help that?
Yeah, I think the first step is always, like you said, getting that client approval first and making that introduction in. Like you led into that, initially when we first started this. That's the first, to get that buy-in. Second, from an IT perspective, especially if it's a regulated industry, we're going to ask those questions. Well, where is this going? How are you storing it? Once the case is over, how does it get destroyed? We're going to safeguard that the same way that we need to safeguard a device that's now coming out of our fleet that we're going to be recycling, right? What are you using for data destruction? How are you doing that? So on and so forth. I think that's one of the big pieces. And then, just kind of getting that comfort level and explaining, well, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. One of the pushbacks we get pushbacks from end users just in general, like, hey, we're going to work on your laptop. We're going to do this. Is it okay if we take your laptop because it needs A, B, and C? There's a bad hard drive. We need to replace a keyboard, whatever. We get those questions too. Well, how do I know it's going to be safe? What are you going to do to safeguard? Well, what happens if it gets stolen out of your car? Everything. Well, does it stay in our car? We're going straight back to the office. This is what we're going to do. Just kind of explaining that whole process of this is what we're doing. We do a lot of data destruction for our customers. A lot of times they have those questions on, well, how do we know it's actually going to be destroyed? Well, this is what we do. This is our process. At the end of the day, you have to have that level of trust, because anybody could say anything, but it's how you're actually delivering. But, if we don't do the things that we're saying, then, we're not servicing our clients the way we should be. But, we have a process in place, and I'm sure you guys have processes in places too. So whenever we're taking a device out of a client site and it's in our hands, well, this is what we're doing to safeguard data. This is what we're doing to safeguard access. This is what we're doing to destroy it once it's done. So just sharing what those processes are. From a remote access standpoint, I'm going to set you guys up the same way I'm going to set up any of our end users. So, you're going to have to do multi-factor authentication. If you're accessing it remotely, well, what's the IP address that you're accessing it from? I'm only going to allow that IP address to enter. So I'm still going to do everything that I can on my end to say, hey, this is how we protect our remote workers for this client, the remote workers for this client. This is how we protect them. You're now essentially a remote worker. This is what you're going to do as well, too. So you're going to have to use our VPN solution. You're going to have to do this. You're going to have to use the multi-factor authentication. But, being that we're working with another IT professional, we're not getting pushback. Well, why do I need to use multi-factor authentication? Well, why do I have to use the app instead? Why can't I just use a text cat? Well, we don't have to go into those deep explanation on why SMS text isn't, the best multi-factor authentication method, because you guys already know, you're already living that as well, too. So, we can just have that discussion and say, okay, well, we're going to set up your remote access. Here's the information I need. You provide that information. And then that starts to build that trust right away. If you say, hey, I need remote access, I'm like, okay, well, this is what you need. If, somebody pushes back and like, well, I need these 18 different IP addresses added because I don't know where I'm going to be working at today. Well, you're going to know where you're going to work at today when you're working on our stuff. That's kind of the answer you get back. But, we've never had those issues working together because, it's been pretty simple. Hey, this is how we safeguard. You're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. Okay, great. And then you move forward. But I think really just having that open discussion, when you first start and then, sticking to what you say, I think Pittsburgh's still a small town, old school town, handshake is good, but, we still have you sign our customers, our clients' non-disclosure agreements, if it's regulated, like HIPAA, for example, we're going to ask you to sign a BAA, we're going to do those things. The same thing we would with any other long-term consultant, the same thing that our clients had us do when we first started working with them. We're going to put those same safeguards in place. So.
Well, and to sort of jump off of something you said, you mentioned, oh, well, we're talking to another IT professional or another professional who understands some of these things. We're not starting from scratch. And and I'll ship this one over to Bill. I think that is what we do. We are the translators between the lawyers and IT to get to the end of the game that they need. And the lawyers don't know what questions to ask IT people. I mean, some are more tech savvy than others, but I think Bill would probably agree most are not. So like we have to look and say, all right, what's the legal strategy? What is it you're trying to accomplish here? How do we marry that up to a task list of things that are going to get us there? And Bill mentioned earlier about, well, when he takes something, he's processing and he's OCRing all these documents. Like, there's a reason why we're doing that for a higher level of searchability. And then what he has to spit out on the tail end, you as an IT professional would probably be like, why the heck would anybody give files like this? And Bill, maybe you can talk about that for a minute, because it's a foreign concept for most people when they get the way we typically produce records. But it's the way it's been done. It's the way of exchanging database information that has to be flexible enough to live in multiple different environments. And Bill, maybe you can just talk about that for a second.
Sure. So, from the onset of this, when we started talking about the meshing of IT and eDiscovery, I don't think we mentioned it, but the standard is we're going to collect this data as is kept in the ordinary course of business, and that's a reasonable standard, and that's what the courts require of our clients. But it comes full circle. So once we start processing it and doing our review and doing the OCR and the searchability and our responsive reviews and stuff like that, then we go ahead and we're going to produce it, and we produce it in a completely different way, a way that I've seen many IT people look at it and say, I've actually had clients IT people come, they've given a production that they've received from somebody else that we may have not been involved with, but it's like they have folders of images and folders of text files and folders of natives and these weird little files that say DAT file or OPT. That's the industry standard of the way we do productions, and IT people don't really, and I wouldn't expect them to understand what those were, because that's far beyond and far removed from what their tasks are on an everyday basis. But yeah, so once we get that stuff, then we have to give it to them in this odd way so that anybody can use it that's involved in the end, the legal dispute, or however it's being produced, whatever it's being produced for, can use it to recreate these documents in a way that they're usable for their purposes. And and we talked a few times about metadata, and it is kind of funny because the metadata that we're working to preserve in these original native files don't even go with the files themselves. They're all put into these load files that says, hey, this date used to be, this date was this for this document. So it's a third file that's basically populating that all this metadata existed, and this is what it said.
Yeah, that's something that, if we're asked to do something, we don't, to your point, we don't get that part. I mean, we certainly understand what metadata is. We understand, different file extensions and, different ways to organize stuff. But the reason why it's organized, the reason, the way you guys do it is something that we don't deal with, right? If we're asked to produce something, we're going to go into the tools that, for email, for example, we're going to go into the tools that are built into Microsoft. And, hopefully the client has the right license that gives us the right set of tools that we need. Most of the time, probably not, so then we're going to do like a basic search. So, if we would try to do something with email, for example, it's going to take us a lot longer because we're going to export it into a PST. We're going to, then do additional searches and do additional manual deletes probably to say, okay, well, this stuff shouldn't be in there because it's supposed to be excluded or whatever. It's much more efficient for us to bring in someone like you, have you do that work and have you organize it in a way that lawyer's going to want to see it and want to read it. We would probably just continuously get questions afterwards to say, well, hey, I'm looking for this file. Well, what was the date on that file? Well, how do you know it was created then? Well, we looked at it here, so that, we're pretty sure that's when it was actually created. Like, there's a lot of questions that we could get back from lawyers that we're honestly not going to know how to answer. We're going to answer it from the technical perspective of it, not the legal perspective of it.
Yeah, it could be as simple as, well, it could be as simple as, well, how did you search those non-text searchable attachments to an email? And you're going to say, well, I didn't. And that's why Bill's OCR, because we have to, with the limitations that are with OCR, but we know that's the industry standard to say, this is as good as we can get it to make sure we've covered everything. Otherwise, somebody's going to fight about that later. And it's as simple as, when we're talking about these weird production files that Bill's sending out in response to discovery requests, that every document is given a unique number that can be tied back to a production, because we might collect off of you today and produce documents in 3 months, and they might be used in a deposition 4 years from now. So somebody has an email in their hand and they're asking somebody questions about it, and the other side says, well, where'd you get that email from? Well, I don't know, it's in our production. Well, we are putting Bates numbers on these documents or other identifiers where it's like, well, here's the control number. I can now tie this back to a production that came from here, which we're able to tie back to say it came from this original source data, so that there's an audit trail from years later about where a record came from. And that's, on the legal side, it's very important. On the IT side, you would say, well, why would anybody need to do that? You got the email right there, or you got a PDF of it. It's just not a world that you would typically live in.
Yeah, it says right in the email it was sent on March 5th,
Right.
at 2:08 p.m. So that's when it was sent. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are in the back end that, certainly, there are going to be IT staff out there that know that, but there's going to be a lot of IT staff that doesn't.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up to the end of our podcast session here. So I think a couple good points to take away from this, if you guys agree with me, are that, communication's key, communication early, explaining what our ultimate purpose and goal is from the legal side to IT certainly can be helpful to say, look, this is why it might seem we're overcomplicating things, but we have to do it for these reasons, or we're going to get screwed up along the way. It's why we may request over collection. It's why we may request access to be able to pull stuff off ourselves. We know you guys are completely capable, and you're probably 10 times smarter than we ever will be on these systems, but I'm the one who's going to have to answer for it eventually. And so it's part of the reason why we have to do that. So it seems like communication is a critical piece to this, and emphasizing that, look, let's work on this stuff together. Let's move data through when it's available and ready. We don't have to wait until it's all done at the end of the day. That lets Bill work on his piece. That gets elements and pressure off the IT folks to be able to, say that they're moving things along on their side as well. Any other final comments from either of you two before we wrap this up?
I have 2 different questions for you guys. So first off, what's there's a ton of different devices out there that everybody's using today. So what is the hardest device in order to back up, preserve, or to, collect data from? I would assume it's smartphones, but I might be missing something.
I would say, it all depends. I think the proprietary systems are always the most difficult. So you got people that are using unique databases, or like you were talking about CAD files. Well, someone's using Primavera or a scheduling system or whatever. It's like, I can't do anything with it. It's going to spit out files for me. We have to work with an expert who understands the system to export reports out. That's the way we're going to have to handle unique databases.
Primavera, that's one I haven't heard in quite some time. But now that you say that, I was very happy when the last client we had got away from that one.
Well, and that ages me, or identifies my time frame. But things like that are probably the most difficult to collect, because we have to have interaction with an expert in there if the data hasn't already been sent out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we might still preserve a database to say, look, this is always here.
We have the underlying database, but there's nothing you can do with it. You need that expert to run reports, and you have to have them sign I would say the affidavit saying, hey, I ran these reports and this is what the database is showing.
Yeah. And the cell phones are probably, to your point, the most difficult because you are wrenching those out of people's hands. Number one, they don't want to give them up easily. There's always the concern about, I've got personal stuff on here more so than anything else. However, there's been big advancements in the last really 6 months, a year, to remote collections. They're not there in their entirety yet, but they're getting better. And even for iPhones, so it used to be you had to mail a kit out to somebody. They would log in, attach it, and you'd almost, you'd do a Zoom meeting type of thing to collect the phone. They'd ship it back. There are now software-based. They install an app on the phone. You can log in. They have to passcode enable it to allow you to get in there. And then you can do a collection through that methodology. So it's making that a lot easier because
that's cloud-based too, correct, Pete?
Yes. So it's cloud-based. And the nice thing with that is that as long as they can plug their phone either into a computer or download the app, there's the potential that we can collect the phone that way. It's still relatively new, but that's going to be a big game changer on the collection side for us because, to your point earlier, if we got to go track down 10 different people at 10 different locations to find when they're available to physically take access to their phone, that becomes a problem. And phones are important in most cases nowadays.
Yeah. So from the IT perspective, when you're working with companies like ours, what's the biggest pushback that you get?
From my perspective, it is usually the fact that employees are allowed to use personal phones for work. That is usually the biggest, if we say, hey, we're going into your work computer, there's usually they're not happy, but
Right.
we can get around that. It's usually for me anyway is, well, yeah, I use this for work, but I have personal stuff on here.
Right.
Well, you probably shouldn't have personal and work mixed, but that's just the way that's the way things go nowadays. And that's usually the biggest pushback for me because they think that their data is going to be compromised in some way.
I think the other piece is I think there's a hesitancy for remote access or admin access of our own to allow us to do some of the collections for whatever reason. And again, it's like we can only push so hard on that, and not always the same timetable urgencies, again, for same reasons. We don't know what's going on in that person's professional life or otherwise at that point in time, but oftentimes we're having to continue to push. We're getting pushed by our clients who we have to push back and say we're waiting, who are pushing back on, and I think there's a lot of time a tendency of people in general to say, well, if I don't have something specific to answer your question right now, I'm just not going to answer anything, where it's better to say I'm working on it, or I ran into this hiccup and this is why it's taking longer, or just something. There's a lot of time you just get silence back, and it's because they don't have anything to report to you, so they don't report anything. That's
actually a common tech thing. I've seen that throughout my career. I don't have an answer for you, so I'm just not going to answer you at all.
Right.
Or I sent you something and you didn't get back to me, or you didn't answer everything back. So instead of me asking again, I'm just going to sit here until you get everything back to me. No, follow up with them.
Right.
Or the other, well, we have a weekly meeting schedule, so I'm going to wait until that weekly meeting. Well, we just had the weekly meeting yesterday, so you're going to wait until next week before you ask the question. Just ask the question now. Like, there's not a reason to wait. So, yeah, that kind of goes back to the whole communications thing. It's just, if you have a question, or ask it, and if somebody asks you a question, answer it. Even if the answer is, I have to get back to you, or I'm not sure I understand what you're asking for. Yeah, I've seen that before, multiple aspects, right? Well, I wasn't really sure what they meant. Okay, well, did you ask them to clarify? No, I just figured I'd ask the next time we meet, or whenever we see them in person. Well, you're never going to see them in person again. Like, they're going to do the rest of the stuff remotely. So, you have to follow up. You have to ask those additional questions.
Or it might be as simple as I'm still alive. I'm out here and working on it. Don't have any more updates. Maybe that's an update. Yeah.
Right.
So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation, and hopefully some of the listeners out there get a chance to understand, some of the interactions between professionals like yourself and Bill. If folks want to get in touch with you for, your expertise, your company services, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Email sales@steelrivertex.com or our website, steelrivertex.com. You also hit me up on LinkedIn as well too. But those are the email or the website best. Call us at the office, 412-832-0613 as well.
Well, and we will put the email address and phone number and the link, the podcast and other data so that people have availability to get to it. But want to thank you both again for joining us. Great conversation and topics. And that invite people to stay tuned for our next episode. We're going to have an interesting one where we're going to bring Jeff Stigler, who's our forensics IT expert, and someone from CSI Corporation, Ashley Miller, who's going to be talking about human trafficking and the intersection between computer forensics and investigations and things like that, and the stuff that that she's seeing out there. So I encourage you to subscribe to Data Discourse, and look forward to having people join us on the next one. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.